So I recently did a video looking at potential cities that could host an OHL expansion team or relocation. And doing that video, I started thinking, well, let's look back at the last OHL expansion. How did it work out? And how did those teams do following the expansion draft? So that was back in 1998. Two teams entered the OHL that season, the Brampton Battalion and the Mississauga Ice Dogs. So it was an interesting situation with these two teams being practically next door neighbors. Brampton, they were first granted an expansion team December 3rd, 1996, followed by Mississauga January 21st, 1997. And for these two arenas, the Paramount Fine Food Center in Mississauga and the CAA Center in Brampton, they're separated by just 6.6 kilometers or a good 10-minute drive along Kennedy. So really close in proximity. And these are markets that have never been tested before in the Ontario Hockey League. So they were looking at the population of the GTA, Peel region in particular, and figuring with the amount of people there, this should generate a lot of interest for junior hockey. That's what they expected going into the expansion draft. Scott Abbott, he was the owner of the Brampton Battalion, actually still the owner of the battalion, even though they moved to North Bay in 2013. And then for the Mississauga Ice Dogs, they were owned by a group which included Don Cherry, who was the part of Hockey Night in Canada at the time, hosting Coach's Corner. So it was an interesting dynamic right off the hop, these two Peel region teams. And for the expansion draft, how it worked, they were both selecting 8 players and who were left unprotected by the 16 of the 18 current OHL teams at the time. And then in the 1998 draft, the Brampton Battalion were handed the first overall selection. And that was because they were the first team to be granted expansion status between the battalion and the Ice Dogs. So going into that draft, the battalion, they would select Jay Harrison, while the Ice Dogs went with Lou Dickinson with the second overall pick. So right away, you could tell the Brampton Battalion were looking defense first. And you have to figure with Stan Butler as a head coach, it made sense. He's got the defense first style for coaching, and it paid off over the years with the battalion. So going into 98, 99, it was also interesting because the Brampton Battalion, they were put in the Midwest Division while Mississauga was put in the Central. So two teams really close together in geography were separated by the East and West conferences. So there was no chance for them to meet in the playoffs unless it was in an OHL final. So it's kind of tough to generate a deep rivalry between these two teams when they would only face each other a few times, but those games wouldn't really impact them in the standings head to head, which would be resolved a few years later when they would eventually move the Brampton Battalion to the Eastern Conference. That was when the North Bay Centennials moved to Saginaw. But getting back on track here, it was also an interesting situation that first year for the Brampton Battalion because they were allowed to have underage player Jason Spezza join their team. They had an underage rule that would permit the 15-year-old player to play on his hometown team. So since Spezza was from Brampton, he was allowed to play on the battalion, where his first year as a 15-year-old, 71 points in 67 games. He was also invited to the OHL All-Star game. So Spezza doing a fantastic job. However, Brampton would miss the playoffs that first year, as would the Mississauga Ice Dogs. Mississauga finished last in the league of 20 teams, which meant they had the first overall pick, and they went with Jason Spezza as he had to go into the OHL draft in 1999. He wasn't with the Ice Dogs long. He had 61 points in 52 games before requesting a trade and ended up with the Windsor Spitfires. So the early years between the Brampton Battalion and the Mississauga Steelheads, very interesting, but Brampton would become the more stable franchise between the two early on. The Battalion, they would make the playoffs in their third season in the Ontario Hockey League, while Mississauga, they went through 6 coaches in the span of 4 seasons. That included a stint where Don Cherry was behind the bench. So Mississauga, they wouldn't make the playoffs until year 5, and that was in 2003. But they were the first of the two teams to appear in an OHL final, where the Mississauga Ice Dogs were swept by the Guelph Storm. The Brampton Battalion, of course, they would make it to the OHL final in 2009. That's where they lost in 5 games to the Windsor Spitfires. So to note, both of these organizations have never won an OHL title, even in their new communities where they are today. So obviously a lot has changed since the 98 expansion. The Ice Dogs would move to Niagara in 2007. And then the battalion would move to North Bay in 2013. So it's interesting when you look back that these two teams were expansion sister teams, built 6 kilometers apart basically, and both end up relocating to other communities, St. Catharines and North Bay. And now those two teams having great success in those two communities with their fan bases. When you look at the overall record, I thought this was fascinating. When you look at the Brampton Battalion versus the Mississauga Ice Dogs, it was Brampton who had the better numbers head to head. They ended up with a record of 36, 23, and 5, and 3 overtime losses. So it was hard going for the Mississauga Ice Dogs. Like I mentioned, it took them 5 seasons before they finally made the playoffs, whereas Brampton, they had that defense first mentality and it paid off, and they would make the playoffs early on. But still, lack of attendance was a factor for both of these two teams and ended up moving. However, for the Mississauga Ice Dogs, they were purchased by Eugene Melnick because he wanted the arena where the Ice Dogs were playing. So he purchased the Ice Dogs and then sold them to the Burks, who moved the team to St. Catharines to become the Niagara Ice Dogs. So it was an interesting time there in Mississauga where they would have a team who would move out. They would get a new team who used to be their rival, and attendance still never improved when they were the Mississauga St. Michael's Majors. And of course, they turned into the Steelheads, and now this summer, they're the Brampton Steelheads. So Peel Region still has their team, but it's just been kind of a card game of just trying to keep up with who's the organization, what's the nickname now, where are they playing, who's in charge. And it's been quite the scene when it comes to OHL hockey in Peel Region. So I just wanted to quickly look at who are the top scorers for the Brampton Battalion and the Mississauga Ice Dogs. We'll start with Brampton. During their time there, Wojtek Wolski, he led the franchise in scoring with 130 goals, 198 assists, good for 328 points. Not too bad for Wolski, who would go on to play in the National Hockey League. Second in franchise scoring, Cody Hodgson, 114 goals, 129 assists, 243 points. Rafi Torres, third in franchise scoring for Brampton, 111 goals, 112 assists, good for 223 points. Luke Lyons, 100 goals, 115 assists, 215 points. That puts him fourth. And then Adam Henrik, he's fifth in franchise scoring, 98 goals, 96 assists, 194 points. Top 3 goalies and wins. Brian Pitton leads the way with 64 wins during his time with the Brampton Battalion, followed by Patrick Colleen, who had 63 wins, and then Brad Topping, who had 61 wins with the Brampton Battalion. Shifting focus now to the Mississauga Ice Dogs, their top 5 scorers. Patrick O'Sullivan leads the way. He had 148 goals, 197 assists, 354 points during his time with Mississauga. And then it's quite the drop in points because second overall in franchise scoring, Michael Swift, 73 goals, 110 assists, 183 points. He would, of course, move to Niagara with the team where he was named captain of the Niagara Ice Dogs. And to note, Michael Swift actually moved to South Korea so he could play for South Korea at the Olympics when they hosted that back in 2018, I believe. But either way, I thought that was interesting. Michael Swift played professionally in Korea so he could play in the Olympics. And then third in franchise scoring, Jordan Owens. He had 69 goals, 84 assists, 153 points during his time with the Mississauga Ice Dogs. Chad Wiseman, fourth, 49 goals, 99 assists, 148 points. And rounding out the top 5 is Chris Lawrence, 67 goals, 57 assists, 124 points. And then looking at the goalies' top 3 wins, Mississauga Ice Dogs history, you have Michael Uzas with 34. Andrew Loverock, he had 31 wins during his time with the Ice Dogs. And David Shantz, he's third with 31 wins. So that's how these two organizations came to be in 1998 through that expansion draft. It'll be interesting to see if the OHL does expand. Will it be a similar process to what we saw back in 98, which was over 25 years ago? So we've had 20 teams since that 98-99 season. And I kind of wonder if we're going to be seeing expansion within the next 5-10 years or so, give or take. But either way, that's how I see it from the booth. That was a fun little look back at 1998's expansion. Let me know in the comments section down below your thoughts or maybe your favorite memory of either team in the Ontario Hockey League. Love the interaction. Thank you very much for all your support. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you again soon.